Be careful, honey. There's going to be a storm tonight. Those were the last words I ever spoke to my wife. She gave me a big smile before she drove off to visit her parents. I closed the door and sat down on the couch. Our golden retriever Gus jumped up on the couch with me and lay his head on my lap. "How are you doing, handsome boy?" I asked Gus as I started to scratch behind his ears. Gus was 5 years old, and we got her from the shelter after our child was stillborn last year. It broke our hearts to lose our son, but I loved Linda with all my heart, and we promised each other we would be all right. Gus really helped us through it, and even though we saved him from the shelter, really he was the one who saved us. Something broke me out of this thought. Gentle raindrops started tapping on the roof, and suddenly my eyes grew very heavy. Gus was already fast asleep on my lap, which certainly didn't help the situation. I checked my phone and the time read 5:23 p.m. I put my phone down and let my head sink down into the cushion as I felt myself drifting to sleep. I jolted awake. Thunder shook the house and lightning illuminated the now dark living room. Gus was looking out the window and whimpering at something. I slowly walked up to the window and noticed something very odd. The neighbor across the street from us, Mr. Wainwright, was standing in the street with his face up to the sky, as if fixated on each drop of rain. He was as still as a statue while the rain hammered down on his old, wrinkled face. I had a strange feeling growing in my stomach, telling me to stay away, but I decided I should go help the man. Just as I was about to open the door, my phone started blaring an emergency message. "This is a message from the Government of Ontario. Please stay indoors and do not go outside. Do not let anyone inside your home if they have been in contact with the rain. This applies to everyone, including members of your own family and loved ones. Most importantly, do not let the rain touch you under any circumstance." Silence filled the air as a chill went down my spine. Something about that message washed dread over me. I couldn't understand why the instructions were to stay out of the rain. It puzzled me, and yet heightened my awareness of Mr. Wainwright's behavior. I looked out into the storm where I had previously seen the man standing in the road. It was now pitch black outside, and I could no longer see the man. It was at this moment I realized that we had completely lost power. My house was completely dark, and the streetlights had stopped working. All of a sudden, I heard a creak on my porch, and I froze in terror. I looked over at Gus, who was now whimpering at the front door. I built up the courage to look through the peephole, and my heart sank. Through the peephole, I saw Mr. Wainwright standing at my front door. His eyes were completely black and seemed much larger than before. He had sharp teeth that reminded me of the mouth of a shark. I had the overwhelming urge to scream. However, I didn't scream. I only stared at this creature with my eyes wide open in terror. It's bizarre how humans react to truly horrifying things. We all expect to scream when we see something of that nature, and yet without fail, there is always that window of time between seeing something we once thought unimaginable and actually screaming. That window of time where we are processing what it is we are seeing is filled with silence and misery. I noticed something else in the seconds before I screamed and jumped back from the peephole. This perhaps was the most horrible thing about Mr. Wainwright's condition. I noticed that his mouth and lips were dry and cracked beyond belief. It looked as if every drop of moisture had been taken away from his face. Even more disturbing was his mouth, spewing water like a waterfall. An ungodly amount of water was coming out of his mouth, and his eyes lit up like the eyes of a tiger who spotted its prey. After what felt like an eternity, although I'm sure it was only a couple of seconds, I fell back from the door and sat down on the floor. I couldn't process what I was seeing. On top of that, the terror I felt was now replaced with a deep sadness. I realized that Mr. Wainwright had a wife and 2 daughters, who he loved dearly. He had a furniture business in town and was always an exceptionally kind man. Now he was just a shell of a man, taken over by something sinister. It controlled him like a marionette puppet, but I sensed that the real Mr. Wainwright was gone forever. "Hello, Eric," croaked a voice from the other side of the door. I didn't know what to say. I didn't even know if I had really heard it. It was so faint and choppy that I could hardly make out the words. Finally, I gained the courage to respond. "Mr. Wainwright, what happened to you?" I asked with a shaky voice. It seemed like a silly question to be asking a man in his condition, but perhaps I was still in shock. Deep down, I hoped I wouldn't get an answer. Unfortunately, I did. "I went in the rain, Derek. I think you should come outside too," he responded. His voice was getting more human-like, but it came out forced and awkward, like he had the words to say, but no idea how to form a sentence. It was like he was learning how to speak. "No, I don't think I will come outside," I told him as confidently as I could. This time, I received no response, simply an animalistic grunt and a bash against my door. He began to bang on the door, but he soon gave up, and I heard footsteps leaving my house. I was shaken up, but I turned my attention to Gus. He was laying by my feet and visibly scared. I bent down and pet him on his head. "It's gonna be okay, Gus. You're a good boy," I said to him with a smile. I went to the kitchen to grab him a treat, and using the light of my phone, searched for my flashlight. I gave the treat to Gus and found the flashlight in one of the drawers. I went back out into the living room to look out the window, and with my flashlight, I saw that Mr. Wainwright had returned back to the middle of the road, which somewhat comforted me. However, he was no longer staring up into the sky. He was staring at me. His eyes were locked onto me, and he had a terrible grin on his face, although the stream of water continued to flow out of his cracked mouth and lips. I also made another startling discovery. There was a deep gash in his head, and blood was being washed away into the rain. I realized that he must have been banging on my door with his head as hard as he could. In the next hours, I began to check every window and door in the house and make sure that everything was shut. I then proceeded to cuddle up on the floor next to Gus, and at some point in the night, I fell asleep. I remember the dream I had very well. I was standing in the hospital room, holding my wife's hand as she was giving birth to our son. "You're almost there, my love," I said to Linda. She was screaming and crying at the top of her lungs. All of a sudden, there was a sound I couldn't believe I was hearing over all the noise of the hospital. It was the sound of gentle rain tapping on the roof. "Something is wrong, Derek," a voice whispered. The words hit me like a truck as I remembered the terrible moments that came next. The problem was when we lost our boy, she screamed those words with true terror in her eyes. In the dream, she whispered them in the most playful tone. Every bone in my body was telling me not to meet my wife's gaze, and yet I felt my body forcing me to look. She had deep black eyes and razor-sharp teeth. Her mouth was cracked, and water began gushing out of it. Just then, I began to hear a baby-like cry. Slowly the room went dark, and the cry turned into a screech, which got louder and louder until I awoke on the floor. It dawned on me that what I was hearing was tires screeching as a car pulled up. "Linda," I said with pure joy in my voice. I got up and ran to the door, my mind racing with the thought of holding my wife and bringing her inside to where it was safe. My hand grabbed the doorknob, and just as I was about to open it, I paused. I heard the same gentle rain tapping on the roof and remembered the horrible sight of Mr. Wainwright last night. In the moments of silence while I contemplated my next move and had the terrible thought of my wife turning into one of those things, I heard the car door slam. This broke me out of the trance, and I began to listen for the footsteps of my wife. All of a sudden I heard fast, choppy footsteps, like my wife had sprinted up to the door and began jumping up on the walls and moving from surface to surface. Finally, I heard a loud bang just above the front door, followed by an unnerving stillness. I stood motionless for a few seconds before I blurted out, "Linda?" "Hello, my love," she responded. It sounded like my wife, her sweet, soothing voice that I fell in love with all those years ago, and yet deep down I had a terrible feeling about the situation. "Honey, can you please just stand in front of the door so I can see your face, and then I can let you in?" I begged my wife. "Derek, I think the rain is doing something to people out there. I was able to stay dry, but I saw something awful. Please let me in," my wife pleaded with me in a worried tone. "Linda, please, just show me your face, and then I can let you in," I said with a sinking feeling in my stomach. I heard a loud bang like something had fallen from above the door, and I heard my wife stand up. "Look through the peephole, my love. I want to come inside with you where it's safe," she said with her soothing voice. I felt the chill go down my spine, and slowly pressed my eye up to the peephole. That's when I saw her face, cracked at the mouth with deep black eyes and sharp teeth. Water was spewing from her mouth, and for the first time since I met my wife, her eyes had no emotion. No sadness, no joy, no anger, no love. That was my first thought, as all hope left my body and tears began to form in my eyes. However, that wasn't true at all. My wife did have one clear look in her horrible pitch-black eyes. Hunger. I started sobbing as I backed away from the front door. I sat down in the hallway and cried for what felt like hours. I didn't hear a single word from my wife the whole time I was grieving her loss. Eventually, I stopped crying, and my sadness was replaced by emptiness. That was when the creature started speaking again. "He's out here too, Derek." The words hit me like a bullet. I knew who she was talking about. Of course I knew. Yet, still, I had to ask her the question. "Who's out there, Linda?" "Damien," she responded in her sweet voice. "It's very strange. After the loss of our son, we never talked about his name. I guess we felt like it'd be easier to grieve that way. However, we both knew that our beautiful child was to be named Damien. The name we both loved for the child we both loved." I stared blankly at the door, still processing the words my wife just spoke. "Look through the peephole, Derek. He looks so handsome," she said with a giggle. I knew that whatever dark forces were controlling my Linda were pure evil, and I wouldn't listen to them. I knew my wife and child were together in heaven, and I wouldn't look through that peephole and tarnish their memory. So I sat there for hours and hours with Gus, while my wife continued to attempt to lure me outside. Days went by, and the monster with my wife's voice had long left, perhaps in search of a new victim. The power was still out, and my phone had no service. The rain continued without even one break, diminishing any hope of escape. I thought about the other way of escaping and joining my wife and child. But just then, I had another thought. Crept up on me like a lion sneaking up on its prey. A thought so obvious. I couldn't believe I hadn't had it before. I needed to go on a walk in the rain to clear my head.